You think medieval castles were cosy halls with roaring fires and walls lined with grand tapestries for insulation. Try frostbite. Try wet stone with no insulation and a bed colder than the air outside. Because in the dead of a 14th century winter, that fireplace wasn't warmth. It was false hope. And no matter your social or economic status, you were one failed harvest away from freezing in your own fortress. The myth versus reality. Castles were fridges. Let's kill the fantasy right now. Medieval castles weren't warm havens of roaring fireplaces and cosy banquets. They were architectural iceboxes. Every inch of those grand stone walls sucked the heat out of the air and radiated cold back at you like a punishment. There was no insulation, no central heating, no window glass until centuries later. Just slabs of rock, open drafts, and wind that never stopped crawling in. Even the grandest of great halls could only manage a single hearth fire, usually at one end, and that flame didn't radiate across the room. It barely warmed a few feet in front of it, if the wind didn't snatch the heat first. Ceilings were vaulted and high, which looked impressive in a tapestry, but meant that any warm air went straight up, leaving the people on the floor cold and damp. This wasn't some cosy medieval Airbnb. This was a fortress, and comfort wasn't the point. Castles were designed for siege survival, not winter. And when the frost rolled in, even kings trembled in their beds. So next time a TV show depicts a noble couple flirting by firelight in a medieval castle, remember, that room was actually more like a walk-in freezer than a film set, and that romantic fireplace, that was all they had, if they were lucky. Construction: stone, wind, and ice. Castles were built to last, but they weren't built to keep you warm. Their walls, often 6 to 12 feet thick, were made of solid stone. And stone is a terrible insulator. It doesn't just fail to hold heat, it actively drains it. Touch those walls in winter and they bite back. Cold to the bone, wet with condensation, and impossible to warm up. Forget drywall, insulation, or even wood paneling. Most interior walls were bare, or plastered at best. And once that surface cooled in late autumn, it stayed cold until spring. And the windows? Tiny slits for archers. Open air, no glass. Maybe a wooden shutter if you were lucky. Maybe oiled parchment or horn to diffuse the wind, but definitely not to stop it. Some castles had wooden floorboards, many didn't. Instead, you had packed earth, laid stone or whatever kept your feet dry until it didn't. Rain leaked through roofs. Snow blew in through the murder holes and chimney shafts. The wind screamed down stairwells like a banshee, and ceilings dripped with condensation that froze overnight. Even castle towers, reserved for the highborn, acted like chimneys, funneling warm air up and out. Bedrooms were stuck in high corners of those towers, away from the central hearth. In winter, they became traps. Castles were not homes, they were military installations. You weren't meant to live well in one. You were meant to not die in a siege. Comfort was a myth, and warmth was a battle, one you rarely won. Heating. The fire wasn't enough. Fire was your best defense against the cold, and it wasn't nearly enough. In most castles, there was only one major fireplace, usually in the Great Hall, a central hearth with no chimney, belching smoke straight into the rafters. The ceiling turned black, your lungs filled with soot, your eyes burned while your hands stayed frozen. Chimneys didn't become widespread until the 14th century. Even then, they were status symbols, not standard. Most rooms had no fireplace at all, just portable braziers filled with hot coals or nothing. Bedrooms, unheated. Corridors, frigid. Towers, death traps. And then there was the cost. Firewood wasn't just hard to find, it was taxed. In some regions, peasants were fined or punished for gathering it without a permit. Forests were owned by lords and kings. Heating your home was a legal risk. Castles tried to stretch their supply. Some burned peat or dried dung. Others rationed logs by the hour. A warm fire was often reserved for visitors, religious leaders, or the dying. And not all wood burned clean. Resinous pine choked you with smoke. Wet wood hissed and popped, sending sparks onto straw floors. In winter, even the rich clustered around the hearth in one room. They ate, prayed, argued, and slept near the fire, not because it was cosy, but because leaving it meant frostbite. The flame wasn't warmth, it was hope, flickering in a stone tomb. And once the logs ran out, you froze, just like everyone else. Bedding and clothing. Sleep in your cloak, or don't sleep at all. You didn't undress for bed in a medieval castle. You clung to your clothes like armour. Because at night, the cold didn't let up. It got worse. The fire died, the stones froze, and your only defence was wool, straw, and body heat. Beds, if you had one, were wooden frames with ropes or slats stretched across and topped with a straw mattress that sagged and rotted fast. Fleas, lice, and mice were standard. Blankets were wool, maybe fur if you were wealthy, but there were no thermal layers, no down comforters, no flannel pyjamas. Even your cloak doubled as a blanket. Nightshirts were rare, so people often slept in the same layers they wore by day, plus anything they could find at night: cloaks, sheepskins, extra tunics, even sacks. And don't count on privacy. Servants, guards, family, everyone often slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed. It wasn't intimacy, it was insulation. A warm bed wasn't just comfort, it was a survival strategy. Wealthier castles tried tricks: heated bricks placed under mattresses, iron warming pans filled with embers and slid between sheets. But those cooled fast and often sparked fires, and the chill wasn't just discomfort, it was dangerous. Medieval Europe saw frostbite, chilblains, and hypothermia long before those words existed. People lost toes, infants died, old men never woke up. In winter, sleep wasn't rest, it was a gamble. And every morning you woke up was a victory. Peasants versus lords. Who froze more? You'd think the nobles had it easy. They had stone castles, tapestries, furs, and servants. But when winter came, the difference between peasant and lord wasn't warmth. It was how you suffered. The peasant hut was crude: wattle and daub, thatched roof, dirt floor. But it had one thing going for it: heat retention. Low ceilings, small rooms, a central fire that heated the entire space, shared with livestock for extra warmth. Cows, pigs, even chickens slept indoors, not for companionship, for insulation. Their body heat made the difference between frost and survival. Meanwhile, in the castle tower, high ceilings meant rising heat. Stone walls bled warmth, and those beautiful arched windows were wind tunnels in disguise. Even the tapestries froze stiff some winters. Lords had furs, servants, and the occasional braziers or warming pans, but they didn't have compact heat. They had draught palaces. Yes, nobles had better food and thicker blankets, but they also had more space to lose heat. More status and less survival instinct. The peasant knew how to trap warmth. The noble expected it to come to him, and that expectation could be fatal. In the medieval winter, comfort was relative, but cold was universal. You could sleep beside a pig or die beside a fire. Class didn't spare you, it just changed the view. How people stayed warm: tricks, dogs, and desperation. If there were no thermostats, radiators, or luxury down duvets, how did anyone survive winter in a castle? Through desperation and ingenuity. People didn't heat buildings, they heated themselves. The first method was huddle or die. Families slept packed together in one bed, often with animals, children, servants, even strangers. Body heat was the most reliable furnace. Wool cloaks were worn inside. Layered tunics doubled as sleepwear. Socks were stuffed with straw. Gloves were sometimes just cloth strips tied around the fingers. If you had a dog, you didn't just let it on the bed. You begged it to stay. The next trick? Clay pots filled with coals. They glowed warm for hours, placed under beds by feet, or even carried like primitive hot water bottles. Some used heated stones wrapped in cloth. And then there was movement. People didn't sit still. They worked, they walked, they fidgeted. You kept moving to keep from freezing. Idleness wasn't just sinful, it was suicidal. Still cold? Drink something. Broth. Weak beer. Anything warm? But here's the brutal truth. Most people didn't stay warm. They just endured the cold better than we can imagine. They didn't beat the chill, they bent to it. Survival wasn't about comfort, it was about staying just warm enough to wake up alive. The Little Ice Age, when winter got meaner. You think everything we've shown you so far sounds brutal. That was just the baseline, because starting in the 1300s, things got colder, much colder. Welcome to the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long deep freeze that turned already miserable winters into death sentences. It hit hardest between 1300 and 1450. Crops failed, rivers froze. Entire villages were snowed in and forgotten. Castles that were already freezing turned into stone coffins. Medieval winters lasted longer, started earlier and ended later. In some years, a summer never came. And without crops, food vanished. Famine followed cold like a shadow. In 1315, a 3-year famine struck northern Europe. Grain rotted in the fields. Horses died. People ate bark, roots, and sometimes each other. Not in some forgotten hellscape. In Europe. In the age of knights and kings. By the time the Black Death arrived in 1347, bodies were already brittle with hunger. The plague didn't create collapse. It finished the job winter started. Castles offered no protection. Lords froze behind battlements, while peasants starved beneath thatch. When the rivers froze, trade stopped. When forests died, firewood vanished. When spring came late, so did the hope of survival. This wasn't a snowstorm. It was a seasonal siege, lasting generations. You'd pray for spring, or die before it came. Winter in a medieval castle wasn't poetic. It was punishment. And when the Little Ice Age hit, even the strong didn't survive by strength. They survived by proximity to fire, or by pure luck. Every breath fogged the air. Every night threatened frostbite. Every morning was a coin toss, warmth or death. So next time you romanticize the medieval castle, remember the wind through the arrow slits, the straw soaked with frost, the baby who didn't wake up, the fire that couldn't burn long enough. You wouldn't feast in that great hall. You'd freeze in it, because in the real Middle Ages, spring wasn't a season. It was salvation. If you believe history isn't what they told us, you're one of us now. If you enjoyed this and are looking for more medieval history, check out one of our last videos. Catch you next time.